Dismemberment, pulling out fingernails, gutting, and so on, you can multiply it by 2. It was the most humane approach compared to what the Russian Cossacks carried out in the Urals and in Siberia. Terror is a natural and necessary form of survival and therefore moral. So it was not white people driving out some abstract Indians who never existed. The idea of a society called American Indians living in harmony with one another until the white people arrived and took their territories is complete absurdity. Today I want to talk with you about that terrible crime committed by white Americans, the colonists, who destroyed the Indians and took their land. This dreadful moral sin lies upon all the descendants of the white colonists as an indelible stain that cannot be erased. We need to agree on certain moral and principled rules, on the yardstick by which we measure this committed crime. And the first statement I want to make is this: those people may be morally condemned who are judged according to the morality of the society in which they lived. Once again, morality is relative. To illustrate this concept, I want to speak about the tortures, those unbelievable, monstrous acts of physical abuse of human flesh, to which Indians subjected other Indians. The source of this information is a fundamental anthropological study, a book first published in 1940, the result of a century of research into this question. And the book is called Torture of Captives by the Indians in the Eastern Part of North America, published by the American Philosophical Society in 1940. Everything you know about extracting pain from the human body, including dismemberment, pulling out fingernails, gutting, and so on, you can multiply by 2. And that is roughly the level of torture to which prisoners of the North American tribes were subjected. War was a normal part of life. And after capturing prisoners or enslaving a neighboring tribe, the men were killed in this terrible, brutal manner and in no other way. The entire victorious tribe would gather, and everyone from the youngest to the oldest would take pleasure in watching this spectacle. For them, it was their baseball, their football, their television, and their soap opera all in one. They tortured people for days, one after another. Screaming, crying, groaning, and spilled blood did not stop after one tribe defeated another. This was necessary from the point of view of military intimidation. If this tribe was defeated by another tribe, the men of that tribe were treated in exactly the same way. Why the men? Because the women were taken as concubines, and they became the second, third, or first wife, depending on their luck, in the new tribe. Their children were members of the tribe, and there was no discrimination. And essentially there was no slavery because this society was still pre-slaveholding. These were hunter-gatherers with early beginnings of agricultural skills, which were practiced by women. The more women engaged in agriculture, the more food was produced for the family. Can we condemn these people? My categorical answer, I do not know what you think, is no, we cannot. According to the moral concepts of their society, this was completely moral, obvious, natural behavior. I simply want to illustrate, without accusing anyone, that morality is relative. Now let us give another example. This is how Gorky describes the tortures that were carried out at the beginning of the last century, about 100 years ago, during the Civil War in the Soviet Union. A quotation. In Siberia, peasants, having dug a pit, lowered captured Red Army soldiers into it headfirst, leaving their legs up to the knees above the ground. Then they gradually filled the pit with earth, watching the convulsions of the legs to see which of the tormented would prove more enduring, more long-lived, and who would suffocate first. In the Tambov province, communists were fastened with railroad spikes through the left hand and the left leg to trees at a height of 1 meter above the ground. And people watched how these deliberately, improperly crucified men suffered while dying. Having stripped a captured officer naked, they cut pieces of skin from his shoulders in the shape of epaulets and in place of the stars hammered in nails, tearing off the skin. Along the lines of the sword belt and the stripes this operation was called, to dress him in uniform. It certainly required quite a lot of time and great skill. Many other things were done as well. Well, I will end the quotation here. You have understood the idea. A question arises, can we condemn this population for the tortures and torment inflicted upon their prisoners? Yes, we can. A question arises, what is the difference? Why? Because from the point of view of the moral field of Russian society and of Orthodox Russian peasants of that time, this was immoral. because Christianity lives by the principle do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So the behavior of the Red Army soldiers and the White Guards, the kind described by Gorky in his work Russian Peasantry, was profoundly immoral. The very same behavior of the American Indians was profoundly moral because it belonged to the moral code of their world. This is the first important point to remember and to agree upon before we move on to further examination. While we discuss this topic, we cannot deny ourselves the pleasure of mentioning the concept that is absolutely false from the point of view of modern anthropology, a concept developed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his work Discourse on the Origin and the Foundations of Inequality Among Men, published in 1755. The book says the following: "Man is born free, but in the civilized world he is everywhere in chains." Another quotation: "The savage man living in nature has fewer needs than the civilized man, and therefore is less subject to misfortune." The next quotation: "Everything that comes from the hands of the Creator is good, everything degenerates in the hands of man." And then follows the glorification of this concept, which ultimately led to Marxism. And Marxism is the creation of a society outside the state, that is, a socially primitive society from the point of view of social structure, but at a new stage of economic and political development, that is, essentially communism. Anthropological studies of the life of primitive tribes in America completely refute this. Everything on which all this later Marxist nonsense was built, including George Dryden, including Michel de Montaigne and many, many other philosophers, was mistaken because they based their reasoning on the theory of the noble savage. Savages were very far from noble from the point of view of today's morality. Wars between tribes were absolutely necessary and flourished at all times. The result of these wars was, naturally, the intermixing of tribes, and an incredible amount of territorial conquest, torture, destruction, and so on. This is the entire history of the American continent. The American continent was settled by humans roughly 20,000 years ago, perhaps 20 to 25,000. Scholars still debate this. Before that, there were no humans on the American continent, not a single one. People came from Asia across the Bering Strait and arrived in at least 3 waves of migration, some say up to 10 waves. In any case, in North America alone, meaning the territory of the modern United States and Canada, there exist 50 language families. Not languages, but language families. For comparison, in Europe there are essentially 3 language families: the Indo-European, the Ugro-Finnic, and the Basque. The only population today that remains, judging by linguistic evidence, of the original people who lived in Europe before the Indo-Europeans arrived, the same Yamnaya civilization from what is now Ukraine, the only survivors not destroyed by their descendants were the Basques. The Ugro-Finns arrived later, as you know. In North America there are 50 language families, thousands of different languages. It is a very extensive, very widely scattered, demographic and eclectic mosaic. And the level of life, the level of civilization, was dispersed from very primitive to fairly developed, but none of them ever entered the Bronze Age. Their tools and hard materials were shells and bones. That was the hardest material they could produce. There was no metallurgy. In other words, it was the Stone Age. There was no wheel, and practically no animals were domesticated except the dog, and the dog came with them from the European continent. Horses existed on the American continent, but they were wiped out, simply eaten to extinction, and the only somewhat domesticated animal among some tribes was the turkey. That is all. There were no other domestic animals. They simply were not able to domesticate them. Agriculture existed in a very primitive form, meaning the soil could not be turned because there was nothing with which to do it. Accordingly, women planted maize, squash, and pumpkin. And these were the main products of agricultural activity. But the primary source of calories was gathering and hunting. Men were engaged in hunting. Women were engaged in gathering and agriculture. The population of this continent reached its peak, estimated at 10 million people in the 11th century, and then began to decline sharply as a result of global cooling, the so-called medieval Ice Age. At the moment when Western Europeans, the British and the Danes arrived here, the population had decreased to at least 5 million people. So the reduction of the population, simply because this continent could not support more than that, from 10 to 5 million, occurred naturally through wars, famine and wars again. Famine forced people to move from one territory to another, seizing parts of the habitat of neighboring tribes, and therefore such wars were continuous. Thousands of archaeological studies have been found showing mass graves where people were killed in battle, injuries, visible traces of wounds on bones. This was the natural way to reduce the population of this region. But instead of killing their infants, the so-called infanticide practiced by the Polynesians, here infants were allowed to grow up, and once grown, they tried to seize the missing territory from their neighbors, and the neighbors tried to do the same. In order to intimidate the neighbor, a constant system of terror and torture was needed. Scalping, traces of which have been found going back to the 5th century, was an ancient tradition of the inhabitants of this territory. And to claim that these were some kind of noble savages who, because there was no private property and society was primitive communal, had achieved some sort of inner harmony and high morality from the point of view of today's concept of morality, is complete and utterly unscientific nonsense. Among the tribes there was no hereditary slavery in our modern understanding, not because they were highly moral, and here Jean-Jacques Rousseau was seriously mistaken, but because it was economically unprofitable for them to keep a slave. A male slave taken on a hunt could defect to the enemy, he was unreliable, he could be killed, and therefore he had to be executed, because to keep him in slavery someone had to watch him. There was nothing physical he could do except hunt. So the tribe was so primitive that male slaves were unnecessary. Women, however, were taken as slaves. They were naturally a sexual and reproductive resource, and they also grew maize and squash, looked after children and the household. But this was not hereditary because the children of captured women became members of the tribe. So it was not morality but economic conditions that produced the absence of a slaveholding society. Another very common and, in my view, very mistaken philosophical concept says that morality is not divine but natural, meaning it is simply the most effective way for humans to behave. It is precisely on this example that I want to refute this concept. Natural human behavior in a situation of resource scarcity is the destruction of competitors, and destruction in the most brutal and terrifying way possible, in order to frighten those competitors so they do not destroy or seize you. So terror is a natural and necessary form of survival and thus moral. But Christian morality, which created women's rights, human rights, the commandment thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not torture, this entire layer of modern Christian and in fact Judeo-Christian morality is absolutely unnatural for human society. Because this morality does not resolve the primary and fundamental question. By what mechanism should depopulation be carried out, meaning the reduction of population when the population occupies more space than that space can support? This brings us to the next, second conclusion, demographic pressure. Across the entire territory of today's United States and the south of Canada, where it was possible to live, an area of roughly 15 million square kilometers, lived a bit more than 5 million people. Those now called indigenous people, and at that time called Indians. 5 million people lived on 15 million square kilometers. At the same moment, we are speaking of the beginning of the colonization of these lands, roughly the beginning of the 17th century. The 1600 years Europe had a bit fewer than 100 million people living on 10 million square kilometers. 5 million on 15, 100 million on 10. Why, you may ask, is such a thing possible? Because Europe had agriculture which, in terms of food production per square kilometer, is highly efficient and can support a larger number of people and, importantly, livestock. Thus, the population, except during epidemics and major wars, was always at the maximum of its possible size. More than 100 million people could not live in Europe at that time because there was simply no way to feed them. All these arguments lead to the fact that there are no indigenous Indian tribes in the essentialist sense, just as there are no primordial Indians. There is a very complex mixture of different ethnic groups and different demographic groups that arrived on this territory over thousands of years from the Asian continent, each of which destroyed, displaced, or resettled those who had come before. It is one huge mixed salad of thousands of different small tribes, each of which was at war with every other. Therefore, if we consider the white newcomers as simply another ethnic group arriving from yet another continent, then what took place was an ordinary, understandable, historically necessary struggle for territory. So it was not white people driving out some abstract Indians who never existed. And into this struggle for territory among the local population, the so-called indigenous people, a new civilization entered, one that was far more effective because of cold steel weapons, production technology, agriculture, and political structure than the peoples who had lived there before. The white settlers brought nothing new in principle except for the fact that they did not torture, torment, or kill the neighboring population without necessity. Instead, they attempted to cooperate, to find mutual understanding, and to trade, which we will discuss a little later. All I want to say in this second part is that the concept of some monolithic society called the American Indians, who lived in harmony with one another until the white people arrived and took their territories, is complete absurdity. The Cherokee tribe had been on that land for no more than 200 years. Before that, they destroyed the preceding tribe that lived there. The Iroquois did the same, and so on. These were constant, unending migrations in which more developed, more technologically capable, and more ferocious ethnic groups destroyed the weaker ones. From this point of view, from the point of view of the morality of that world, white Europeans were far more highly moral than the other ethnic groups living on that territory. The mere fact that white people crossed the ocean to get here does not make them an exception or anything new, because all other people who arrived on this continent also crossed an ocean to get here. I will remind you once again, 25,000 years ago on the American continent, both north and south, there was not a single Homo sapiens. From the point of view of an agricultural society, land cannot avoid being private property, because a vast amount of effort and resources must be put into cultivating it. Stones are taken out of the soil, trees are burned or cut down, roots are pulled out, which the Indians did not know how to do. Level fields are created, swampy lowlands are drained, dry places are irrigated instead, and in this state, the land receives enormous labor before planting even begins. If the land is not property, it can be abandoned and one can move to another plot when the soil is exhausted and agriculture becomes impossible. I do not know whether you like this or not, but the fact remains that the Europeans who came to America were essentially an agricultural culture. They obtained their main food by cultivating land. To do this, land had to be acquired, had to be owned. Otherwise, it made no sense to invest that backbreaking work into making the soil suitable for agriculture. The Indians, as I have already said, were for the most part, especially the Indians on the eastern coast, hunters and gatherers. For them, land was a hunting ground where they could hunt. The concept of private property in land was absolutely incomprehensible to them in principle, which brings us to the famous story of the purchase of Manhattan. The entire island of Manhattan along the Hudson River, called Guzon in Russian, was purchased by the Dutch. This entire territory in 1626 was called the West Indies. Therefore, there was the Dutch West India Company. It had a local representative, a certain Peter Minuit, and this Peter, made a deal with the local Indians. In exchange for beads, metal, glass, and other goods that were very necessary for the Indians, he bought the island of Manhattan. And here misunderstanding began between the Indians and the Europeans. The misunderstanding was twofold. The Indians did not understand that the land no longer belonged to them, and they did not understand the concept of long-term obligations. A few years later, the Indians began to violate the inviolability of that land, in simple terms, to hunt on agricultural fields. A conflict began. Scholars still debate what happened, what went wrong. The first version is that the land was sold by tribes that were not the ones who considered it theirs. Try to figure out who among these people was the legal owner of Manhattan. The second version is that the locals did not understand what they were doing, and they believed that they had been paid for a right of settlement, that the land still belonged to them, but they simply did not grasp this concept, and they thought they had been paid for letting Europeans live there. Be that as it may, why do I bring up this well-known case? Because an obvious attempt was made, as on other territories, to acquire property rights. I give you what you need, and I receive from you what I need, on voluntary, mutually beneficial terms, without the use of force. This is important. Throughout the entire history of the colonization of Siberia, and also throughout the entire history of the colonization of Latin America, neither ethnic group, neither the Spanish nor the Russians, ever used this method, a voluntary exchange of money for land instead of conquest. That is, the seizure of territory. All of Siberia was not purchased, but taken by force. And there were no attempts to reach agreements with the local population. The local population was enslaved, or if not enslaved, subjected to what was called yasak. Yasak was a tribute that local tribes were obliged to pay, and if they did not pay, the chief and his children would be killed, and so on. Thus, again, I am not introducing moral judgments. I am simply comparing like with like in the same era. Of all the possible ways of colonizing the territories of weaker civilizations, of which at that moment there were, roughly speaking, 3. No, Africa was not colonized, India and Asia were not colonized. The regions subjected to colonization were North America, South America, and Siberia. And among these 3 colonizations, North America experienced the mildest and most sparing form, through cooperation and collaboration, which are essentially the same thing, through the purchase of land and the exchange of goods for goods. That is, the Northern Europeans attempted to establish trade. You give us furs, we give you metals, nails, weapons, and everything else that was so necessary for you. To illustrate this, it is worth truthfully recounting the story of the Jamestown settlement, Pocahontas, and all those cartoons, not as a caricature, but as a historically accurate sequence of events from which certain conclusions may be drawn. So in the year 1609 in Jamestown, there lived about 300 people, colonists, who tried to trade furs with the local population, providing them with industrially produced goods in exchange. That is, they did not destroy and did not kill, they traded. They built a fort, essentially a small fortress, and had some garden agricultural plots around it, and they relied on trade with the locals for food supplies. We give you what you need, and you continue to supply us with furs and meat. Famine broke out because there was a severe crop failure, bad weather, and climate change. For 1 year, there was no delivery of goods or food from the continent. Accordingly, the leader of the local tribes, a confederation of tribes, a certain chief Powhatan, ordered the British to be destroyed. How did he order this to be done? They were practically blockaded inside their fort. They could not go out to hunt. They could not go out to fish. They could not go out to gather harvests. They were simply sealed inside their fort in violation of the agreements they believed they had with the local population. But the agreements did not work. And during that winter of 1609 to 1610, out of 300 people, only 60 remained, and they ate all the dogs, all the snakes, all the rats, and then moved on, as expected, to cannibalism. All of this was documented because they were literate and could write. This period is known as the Starving Time. In the spring of 1610, new ships arrived with provisions, reinforcements, and weapons, and they found these dying people, after which an order was given, and for the first time after aggression had been used against them, they responded with aggression, and a punitive expedition began against the tribes that had carried out what in today's terms would be called genocide. At that time, it was a struggle for survival on both sides. This entered history as the First Anglo-Powhatan War of 1609 to 1614. It turned out that these white settlers could kill very effectively, no less effectively than the Indians, and a peace had to be concluded, the culmination of which was the marriage of Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, to John Rolfe, That is where the First Powhatan War ended, but it was only the beginning. Pocahontas died in 1618, and power in the tribe, in this confederation of tribes, passed to his brother Opechancanough. At this time, having learned from previous experience, the British seized land and agricultural fields, cleared them, and began producing food. Understanding that they could no longer depend on receiving provisions from the Indians, and they also began developing tobacco plantations because tobacco was becoming fashionable, sending tobacco from west to east. Accordingly, they seized large territories, and already in 22, on the 22nd of May, the new chief gave the order and several settlements, for by then there were several were attacked, and 347 colonists were killed in a sudden assault, roughly 1/4 of the 1,200 who lived there, that is, in Virginia, as it was called. There lived 1,200 people, and as a result of a single day's attack, 1/4 were killed. The Europeans took up arms and responded with punitive expeditions, burned several nearby villages, and cleared the surrounding area in order to create a safe zone. I draw your attention to the fact that in violation of local customs and traditions, no one was taken prisoner, no one was tortured or burned, no fingernails were torn out, no eyes were gouged out, no organs were cut off, and so on. It was simply a punitive expedition triggered, from the European point of view, by unprovoked aggression. The Indians could be perfectly well understood. Newcomers had arrived who, in their view, should not be there, and were infringing upon them, and in addition there was the spread of diseases which we will discuss separately, and the Europeans could also be understood because despite the existing agreements they had been subjected to unprovoked aggression. But I emphasize once again that I do not want to draw a moral line, because today's morality is inapplicable, and one must compare like with like. Nowhere, neither in Siberia nor in South America, did anything of this sort occur in which Europeans initially tried to coexist rather than seize and destroy. The British and the Danes and later the French arrived with a concept of coexistence. Let us live, and we will trade to mutual benefit. After this, the Third Anglo-Powhatan War of 1644 to 1646 broke out. By that time, the British colony had already reached 8,000 inhabitants, and in April, in the spring of 44, there was again a coordinated attack, and in a single day 500 people out of the 8,000 population were killed. The response was the same, again retaliation, that is, a counterstrike from the colonists. The chief who led the attack was captured and killed, but not tortured. You understand? When a tribe accustomed to viewing torture as a sign of strength is instead executed honorably by gunfire, you do not intimidate them. You fail to fit into the local culture. A new treaty was signed in 1646, which essentially ended these wars. This third war illustrates the numerous similar ones, and I will not weary you with all of them, where the scenario was always the same. Europeans attempted to build coexistence and cooperation, dividing land and territory on mutually beneficial terms. We bring you items of civilization and manufactured goods, mirrors, fishing rods, hooks, the newest technologies, and we exchange them with you. You give us what we consider valuable furs and food products that we could preserve. But the locals clearly understood the threat of this colonization and fought against the colonists. It was a struggle for territorial control, as it occurred everywhere in the world. And once again, for the third time, hear me clearly, this was the most humane of all inhumane approaches. It was the most humane approach compared to what the Russian Cossacks carried out in the Urals and in Siberia, and compared to what the conquistadors did in Latin America. Why do we even need to speak of conquistadors or of Cossacks when we have historical examples of how Russians destroyed Russians and neighboring peoples? Let us begin with the massacre in Kazan, organized by Ivan the Terrible. After the fall of Kazan on the 2nd of October, 1552, 40,000 people were slaughtered, killed in a single day. Imagine the volume of blood in liters. An unspecified number of people fled to Siberia, and an unspecified number of women and men were taken into slavery. Well, let that be. These were Chuchmeks. Excuse me, do not be offended. This is from the point of view of Russian prejudices. Next came the destruction of the Novgorod Republic. What are we talking about? The Novgorod Massacre. This was the same historical period, the same region. 70,000 were killed, tortured, tormented. Terror was sown. These were their own people. These were Orthodox Christians. This was the same race. This was the same language. The English merchant Jerome Horsey testifies that he saw women, children, and old people tied to sledges and dragged along the river where they were drowned while the ice was broken by hooves. What the British did in relation to the Indians was the most humane treatment compared with what at that same period the Russian holders of power did to their own people. Terror walked across Russia. Villages and districts were destroyed. Thousands and hundreds of thousands were tortured by hunger, killed and perished. Do not tell me about the horrors of Pocahontas. Let us turn to Russian history, and so as not to offend anyone, to Ukrainian history as well. The uprising of Bohdan Khmelnytsky from 1648 to 1657, practically the same historical period. According to the chronicles of contemporaries, for example, in the book Abyss of Despair, Nathan Hanover describes the horrors that the Orthodox inflicted upon the Jews. The degree of devastation reached from 50 to 90% in different regions, and I list only several towns where tens of thousands died in each of these towns. Nemiriv 8,000, Tulshin 6,000, Pelyavitsy 10,000, Zaslav Ostro 15,000, Boriv 6,000. This was in 49. In 51, Berestechko tens of thousands, Bila Tserkva several tens of thousands. My surname Lyubarsky comes from the town of Lyubar, where the Lyubar massacre was carried out. Several thousand Jews were slaughtered and the rest fled. My surname comes from the town of Lyubar in the Zhytomyr region. Lyubar. These were, forgive me, not savages. Such were the customs. Therefore, either you, ladies and gentlemen, apply today's morality, and then we judge everyone, absolutely everyone, the British, the Ukrainians, the Orthodox, the Russians, or we acknowledge that in that era, customs were different, and in that case, we cannot choose one culture to condemn, while for some reason not condemning another. This brings us to the necessary discussion of diseases, chiefly smallpox, but also influenza and other viral and bacterial infections. 90% of the local population, the so-called indigenous people, died as a result of viral and bacterial infections. Their immune system was not adapted to European diseases. The same story occurred in Siberia, the same story in Latin America. In most cases, it was an unintended consequence of communication, of contact, of the mixing of these European Asian cultures in relation to such diseases with the indigenous local cultures that had no immunity and therefore perished. Were there cases of deliberate infection? Yes, there were. Yes, those notorious blankets existed. But one must place all of this into its proper context. A Franco-Indian war was taking place. I will discuss it in my next talk. But this was a war between the French together with the Indians against the British. A huge 7 years war was underway in Europe. In this war, the British commander-in-chief Geoffrey Amherst wrote to Colonel Henry Bouquet the following letter in 1763. Could we devise a way to transmit smallpox to those malcontents, that is, to the uprising Indian tribes? Bouquet replied that he would think about it and devise such a method, after which on the 24th of June 1763, the trader William Trent noted in his journal that a delegation of Delawares had arrived for negotiations and that they would be given blankets from the Fort Pitt Hospital where smallpox patients lay, in order to infect the Delaware population with smallpox. This was done and is unequivocally documented by the decision of the British military leadership. So that there is no doubt, because some try to argue that this never happened, no, at least this case is documented. The correspondence between Amherst and Bouquet is kept in the British Library, and Trent's journal, the journal of the merchant who actually delivered the blankets, is kept in the Pennsylvania archives. These are documented archival records. It is entirely obvious there may have been other examples of using smallpox to infect the local population during war as a biological weapon. Did this constitute a violation of any moral principles or standards existing at that time in war? No, it did not. Let us again consider my first point, comparing like with like, judging by the moral categories that prevailed in that era. In the period from 1930 to 1945, Japan developed the so-called Unit 731. This is the name of the unit that released fleas infected with plague in China. Millions died. This was the first documented case of the use of bacteriological weapons. The Soviet Union, until the early 1990s, only in the early 1990s was biological and bacteriological warfare outlawed, had been developing a secret program on anthrax. It was considered a possible option for conducting military operations. Therefore, before we accuse the British of immorality, which indeed must be done, let us recall according to which moral canon we are to judge them. According to the moral canon of the year 2025, when this is unquestionably forbidden and immoral, or according to the moral canon of the year 1940, when Russia was preparing biological weapons, one must judge events within the context in which those events occurred. But denying the fact that the use of smallpox to infect the local population during the so-called Franco-Indian War, and after it, and by the way, after it as well, took place is impossible. But before I finish today's talk, I want to quote a number of the many apologies issued by the American people through their government to the indigenous population. In 1993, Congress adopted and President Bill Clinton signed a joint resolution, the so-called Apology Resolution, officially offering apologies to the indigenous people of Hawaii for the participation of the United States in the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. Has Russia ever signed a formal apology to the Tatar people for the overthrow of Kazan's rule? Do not make my slippers laugh. In 2009, there were apologies to the American Indians. In December 2009, a law was adopted expressing regret and offering apologies for, I quote, many instances of violence, cruelty, and denial of rights by United States citizens toward indigenous peoples. Obama signed it. In September 2024, there were apologies from the United States Navy, September of 24, to the communities of Alaska. What were they apologizing for? For the destruction by the military during the suppression of uprisings in Alaska of two villages, Cake and Angoon, in 1869 and 1882, respectively. In that same year, 24, on the 25th of October, Biden signed a congressional resolution issuing public apologies for the federal system of schools and boarding schools for Native Americans that operated from 1819 to 1969, aimed at the forced assimilation of children. He called this a disgrace to the history of the United States and a sin on our soul that must be washed away. Has anyone apologized to the Jews for creating the same kind of boarding schools for their assimilation, the so-called cantons and cantonists? Forget it. Do not make your slippers hurry. Why am I telling all this? Despite the bitter truth shared by the American people and the peoples who inhabited the North American continent, the situation is far more complex than the simplistic picture you were offered. And what is fundamentally important to me is this. The American people have offered their apologies and made certain reparations. We can judge them to be large or small. We can discuss whether this is a plus or a minus. I believe that these reparations in fact destroy the ability of the indigenous population to prosper. But we will discuss all of this in the next talk. Thank you. Goodbye. See you next time.